Hey up! Right, before we get started, I won't be here on Friday. We've got relatives coming down middle of the week to stay over the bank holiday, so it just seems a bit ignorant me making videos and editing them while they're here. So there'll be no video on Friday. I'll be back next Wednesday. Now, today's subject, riding gear back in the 1980s. I started riding in 81, and actually I was riding pillion back in 1979, so I got some of my gear together then. I started riding in 81, and I first found myself in a position when I joined the police in 83 to buy some decent riding gear. So I'm going to go through what riding gear I had back then, and also how it compares to modern stuff, because we've got all these modern safety standards with you know, PPE for riders, jackets, helmets, trousers, that kind of thing, and everybody thinks that you know, you absolutely must wear this stuff. I don't wear it because when I started riding, none of that existed, and you know, I'm still here. I've never had any major injuries, and I've had a few spills over the years. Now, starting off with helmets, back in the 1970s, there were two major UK helmet manufacturers. There was Stadium and there was a company called Centurion. They sort of brought the first British-made full-faced helmets out in the late 1970s, and I actually had a Centurion. I think it was a Centurion 1000, I'm not sure, but I bought that in 79. We had a relative that had a motorbike, and he used to take me pillion quite regularly, so I ended up buying myself a helmet, and it was actually one that had been in the shop window for about 4 years in a local shop in Hull. Compared to modern helmets, you know, it was a really basic piece of kit with the visor that had to be press studded down, otherwise it would just rattle away at you all the time you were riding. As I say, really basic stuff. Now, I think these were about 25 or 30 pounds, but this had been sitting in a shop window, and in retrospect, it probably wasn't safe because you know, the ultraviolet radiation that had been beating down on it for 4 years while it sat in that shop window had probably destroyed its structural integrity. In fact, I remember it wasn't painted. It was made of a sort of a mid-blue plastic with some typical 1970s stickers on the side to make it look flashy. And when you actually looked at it head on, you could see that it had faded substantially on one side compared to the other side that had been exposed to the sunlight. Now, I actually got it because they were trying to get rid of it for £10, and I bought that in about 1979, and I continued riding with that helmet for years. Now, you know, prior to 1983, I started riding in 81. I didn't have any dedicated motorcycling gear at all. I had just a normal sort of showerproof jacket that you would buy, you know, for normal day-to-day use. I used to ride in my jeans, and it was a matter of whatever trousers I happened to be wearing, which were usually jeans. And I had a pair of ex-police gloves that my dad gave them to me, but my brother had passed them to my dad, and my dad gave them to me. Really thin, not much more than dress gloves really, to keep the wind off you, but really ill prepared for motorcycling. Yet I commuted to university for the best part of a year, or over a year, wearing that gear, and I survived. Now, going to 1983, October 83, I bought my first new bike when I joined the police, and I reserved a budget of £100 to get my gear. Now, that didn't include the helmet because I continued using the blue Centurion helmet that I had. But what it allowed me to get was a decent pair of gloves, and a decent jacket, and a pair of boots for riding, because I knew that I was going to be doing shift work. I knew that I would have to ride in all weathers, and you know, back in 1980 we had some really bad winters, you know, some of the coldest winters on record, so you know, I certainly needed that gear. Now, the first thing, I remember standing in Miles Kingsport in the original Anlaby Road shop underneath the flyover, looking through all the motorcycle gear that they had. I'd just ordered my bike, a Suzuki GS125, and I had this sort of £100 surplus burning a hole in my pocket to get my gear. And I remember looking at the leather jackets. They were £100, so just the jacket alone would have blown my entire budget. So I looked at the wax cotton alternatives. Now, a lot of people say to me, wax cotton is no good on a motorcycle. It lets the water in, and in the event of a crash, you know, it's just going to fall apart. Actually, it doesn't. That's an old wives' tale. Wax cotton was brought in for a very good reason. I mean, it was introduced to motorcycling back in the 1930s. The wax dressing that's impregnated into the cloth actually lubricates in the event of a slide, so you don't get that immediate abrasion to the fabric. It gives you a vital sort of, you know, split second, 2 split seconds that prevents the fibres from drying out and then burning through and abrading. And actually, it was the engineering using old materials rather than relying on modern technology that made them successful and safe for the time. They won't match modern safety standards, but a Belstaff jacket of that era was made from 10-ounce cotton. The one that I had was the Belstaff Roadmaster. Now that had a layer of cotton padding between the lining. It was unlike this that we see now, it was like a red, tartan interior, but it had quite a thick quilted cotton padding in between. That was mainly for insulation against the cold, but it also was another layer of protection against abrasion, because the road surface has to wear through that. What I'm going to do, just going to take this off for a moment. It actually has to wear through that before it gets to the cotton inner lining. So, you know, it was actually pretty decent safety gear. As I say, it doesn't match modern standards, but I would say it probably falls somewhere between A-rated and double A-rated as modern clothing goes. Now, back then, this is a 1948 replica. It's just a fashion garment, really. But back then, it was a 10-ounce wax cotton. It was a really heavy, dense weave. And then between the cotton inner lining and the outer shell, you had, I don't know, a few millimetres of quilted cotton padding. Now, that in itself was a really quite a resilient protection, or outer shell, to protect you from the from abrasion on the road in the event of you sliding along the road. But what they did is they then doubled up on the elbows and on the shoulders with an extra layer or a patch of the same stuff. So effectively, in the key areas, you had a total of 20 ounces of waxed cotton. So, you know, when you were sliding, it had to burn through the wax, then it had to burn through the first layer of cotton, then it had to burn through more wax, then the second layer of cotton, and then it still had to get through the the padding, that thin layer of cotton padding in between, which was held together. It was quilted, so it was held together in little pockets inside, and then get through the lining before it reached the actual clothing you were wearing underneath. So it was actually very effective. A lot of people trash it and say, you know, this old technology is no good. It was very good for the time. Also, the felt stitches that they used, they were often triple stitched with a felt stitch, especially in the areas that were important, the areas that were liable to burst apart. So you had, again, additional layers of fabric because of the way the fabric was folded on those seams that prevented immediate sort of destruction of those seams. So it was actually pretty decent gear. People look back at it and say, oh, that was nothing, it wasn't a patch on what we've got now, but it was comparable to, certainly to A-rated gear, which is rated up to 20 miles an hour, But I would say, looking at the research I've done, it sat somewhere between A and AA rated, which is what most people are riding around in nowadays. A lot of people don't want to pay for AAA stuff, the top end stuff. So a lot of people are riding around with that kind of gear anyway. Now, what we didn't have then, of course, was armour. That hadn't been invented yet. There were no safety standards as such that dictated stuff like that had to be put in. So, yeah, you could crack elbows and shoulders, but that was the best that we had at the time. That's how we survived, as I say, working shifts, leaving work on nights when there was black ice everywhere. It was a really precarious situation. I didn't have the backup of a car to drive in, when the weather was bad. I had to use my bike no matter what. And that Belstaff Roadmaster served me really well. It was a little bit warm in the summer months because it had that permanent insulation in it. The other things that it had is a reversible belt. Now, I think they brought that in 1981. It had a standard black belt like this one, but you could reverse it to have the other side facing out, and that was covered with a white reflective strip for high visibility in darkness and low light weather. It also, at the back, where the sort of shoulder seam is across the back, there was a sort of a pocket, and inside that pocket you could open it up and pull out a triangle of the same reflective material, which again increased visibility to anybody behind you. So they were just starting to think about safety then and how to protect the rider, and it was the best that was available, and it actually worked pretty well. Now, moving along to gloves. I got the Belstaff jacket because that particular one, it had the reflective pieces on it. Now, I remember there was a Barber International jacket there, but that was like this. There was no lining in it, and it didn't have the reflective panels on it. So the Belstaff just seemed like better value for money, which is really how Belstaff survived at the time. They didn't have the reputation that Barber had. But they increased the specification of their clothing and equipment to make it look like a better deal than the Barber stuff was. With the Barber, you had to buy an additional liner. It was the same price. It was £50 for the Barber International. But if you wanted protection against the cold in winter, you had to buy the additional liner. I can't remember how much that cost, but it just made the Belstaff so much better value for money. Now, at the same time, for £10, I bought a pair of gold top motorway gloves, and these are the closest I can find really to them. These are the Moto Spirits, just a basic motorcycle glove. They were a little bit longer at the cuff than these are, and they had a little bit more padding for insulation again against the weather during the winter months, with just one press stud fastening on them. And I had those for years. They served me really well. They didn't keep the cold out particularly well, but as you know, even riding today, most of the high-tech gear doesn't either, unless you've got heated gloves or heated grips. I think heated grips might have been available from Oxford back then, but they weren't really very reliable. And most people didn't really trust them, and most people couldn't afford them because we were cash strapped. We just didn't have the money to spend on extra gear. We had to sort of manage with the lowest budget we possibly could. So yeah, I had those gold top gloves for years, and I remember actually eventually they were permanently deformed in a gripping position because in winter it used to get so cold. I had a 4-cylinder GSX 550 ES. It used to get so cold that when I stopped at traffic lights with my gloves on to try and get the feeling back in my fingers before the lights changed, I used to grip onto header pipes on the bike to just quickly get some heat into my hands so that I could continue to the next set of traffic lights. So eventually that heat damaged them and they just sort of curled up and stayed permanently curled up. Yeah, the things we used to do. Now, trousers. Ordinarily, back then, I would wear my jeans if it was my day off. But when I was going to work, one of the beauties of the job that I had when I was in the police is that back in the 1980s, the police uniform was quite a thick woolen serge, and wool, again, is a really good abrasive resistant material. There are one or two sort of high-end companies that still make woolen riding gear because it has such good properties against abrasion. So, you know, I mean, I do remember tearing holes in them once or twice, or certainly scuffing them to the point where they weren't fit for wearing at work. But that actually afforded me some of the best protection, because most of my little spills tended to be either going to work on early turn shifts or coming home from work after night shifts, or even on late turn shifts, because, you know, when it was dark, that's when the temperatures would plummet. And it's like I said, the 80s was a really cold decade. That's when you would get your black ice, etc. So it was usually low speed tumbles, traffic lights, stuff like that. In fact, I remember a story back in about, I think it would have been 84, late 84, or maybe early 85, Myton Street Bridge. Back in those days, at the bottom of Myton Street Bridge, there was a crossroads. You went off to the marketplace on the right, and then off onto the marina, what is now the marina, on the left. And you come down the bridge, and then there was traffic lights at the bottom where you had to stop. And I remember, I can't remember where I was going, but there was just a thin covering of snow. I was riding in the snow. You had to. We didn't have a choice because that was the only transport I had. I was riding in the snow with just a thin covering of snow on the floor. Halfway down, I wasn't going fast anyway, but halfway down, I knew I couldn't touch my front brake because the bike could just go from under me. I tried to apply my rear brake, and the back wheel just instantly locked up because it was too slippery. And as I got down to the bottom, I got it down into first gear to try and use engine braking as much as I could. But as I got to the bottom, the situation just didn't get any better. And I knew, even though the lights had turned red, I wasn't going to be able to stop. And I remember sort of sitting on my GSX 550, I looked to my right and there were two coppers sat in a police car sort of facing me, looking right at me at the traffic lights, and I couldn't stop. All I could do was just sail through the red light. Don't forget, we didn't have any ABS back in those days to help us out. There was just no way I was going to stop. And I just sat there on my bike, sort of looking at them as if to say, you know, there's nothing I can do about it. And they understood. They didn't follow me and pull me up. I think they understood fully what had gone on. But yeah, you had to ride in all conditions, no matter what. Now, for weather protection, I would normally just wear a pair. I still wear them now, not the same ones, but I still wear now just nylon over trousers to keep the wind and the rain off in cold, wet weather. Again, you know, I normally just wear ordinary jeans underneath. Yeah, I mean, let's put it into perspective. 45 years, yeah, I've had a few spills, but I'm still here. And I've never had a serious injury from a bike drop. So, yeah, I think people do lean too much into, you know, modern safety gear. I've survived quite well without it. I maybe had sort of 7 or 8 years where I was wearing armoured gear, and I just found it too much of a compromise to comfort over, you know, the actual protection that I consider that it provides me. Now, finally, boots. I bought a pair of Frank Thomas boots. I think they were £35. So, you know, with that £100 budget, they'd pretty much blown the entire budget. There was maybe a little bit of money left over. I don't know what I did with it. But I got a pair of Frank Thomas boots. Now, these were similar to these gold top boots. I think these are called the gold top Cafe Racer. They were a very similar thing. They came up a little bit higher than these do, but they were certainly a much plainer design. You know, they were just the bare bones of a boot. If I remember rightly, they had a leather sole on them, so again, you know, in icy and wet weather, if you were paddling the bike about, they could be a bit hazardous. They weren't great. They really restricted your movement when you were walking. They were great on a bike, but as soon as you got off the bike, you know, you were walking like a thunderbird because you couldn't bend your ankles properly. Now, they were okay. The thing about most of the sort of boots that were available then, they were far superior. Like these gold top ones, they were far superior to what most of us can buy today. I mean, you can easily spend a couple of £100 on a pair of motorcycle boots, CE approved motorcycle boots, that are basically, you know, the soles are just glued on. They use a very cheap sort of manufacturing process to increase profits. These are actually made in Europe, and these are made to a very similar specification that they were still making them in back in the 1980s, in that the upper is not just glued but also sewn onto the sole. I'm not quite sure what these are. I think these might be a Blake stitch. I'm not actually familiar with the way these are fastened on, but they're actually stitched all the way through, so the sole is stitched onto a welt, which is, yeah, I can't quite work that out. What I'm not sure what sort of welt they've used on these. It's unfamiliar to me. It might be a Goodyear welt that's just been made in a way that fancies it up a little bit. But they were going to companies like, you know, all the old makers, Crockett and Jones and Cheney's, to get the boots made. So they were bench grade. You know, motorcycle boots were bench grade boots. They weren't the filth that you buy nowadays that passes as motorcycle boots. They were proper, well put together. I mean, these particular boots, Gold Top sent these through to me nearly 2 years ago, and I've not reviewed them yet. I feel a bit guilty about it. But, you know, these are CE approved, but they're built to the old standard. They're not, I mean, you pay for it, like you do with all bench grade footwear. They're made in Europe. They're handmade, and, you know, they are up to the standard that we used to you know, wear back in the 1980s, and, you know, further back than that. So yeah, they gave you a lot of protection, you know, from the elements and in the event of a crash, but they weren't great for walking around in. You know, they were purely motorcycle boots, and that was it. And I remember I did stop wearing them, especially for work, because they were a little bit, they were, you know, as I say, they came up further than these, and they were quite wide at the top. And the problem was I couldn't get them up inside my trousers, so you had to tuck your trousers into them, as I have done here. The problem with that is it would crease my uniform trousers, so they would look untidy when I took my boots off. So I stopped wearing them for work, and I just used whatever footwear I happened to be working in that day. So they weren't very successful for me as motorcycle boots. I'd still wear them, you know, if I went touring or, you know, weekend use, etc., because I could tuck my jeans into them, and it didn't matter if the jeans got a bit crumpled. But yeah, certainly when I was going to and from work, I just used to wear ordinary gear. I remember they weren't particularly waterproof either. I frequently used to have to use the plastic bag trick of, you know, putting a plastic bag onto your foot first before you put your boots on, so that any water that got into your boots didn't get directly to your feet. There's nothing worse than turning up on an early turn in wet weather with, you know, your feet already soaking wet. So yeah, I mean, they were a compromise in a lot of ways, but they were far higher quality than the stuff that we get now. I think just the waterproofing technology wasn't there, and at the price point that we're selling them for, like, you know, 25, 35 pounds, to them it wasn't worth, you know, spending an extra £5 or whatever, but putting some sort of waterproof membrane in, or making sure that they were watertight. That they had to be sold down to a price, so that they gave you the protection, they gave you 80% of the weather resistance. They just didn't perform very well in really wet weather. So yeah, actually, you know, we had some fairly decent biking gear that still, to a large extent, stands up to scrutiny today. You know, we didn't have armour. I'm not a great fan of armour myself, but you know, you've only got to look at a lot of the waxed cotton jackets that are available these days, that they'll use a much thinner waxed cotton. It's like I said, this really is just a fashion garment. It's not intended for motorcycle use. I think it's only something like maybe 6 or 8 ounces, I can't remember. But you know, a lot of the gear that they sell these days, it'll be fairly thin waxed cotton with some sort of protective underlayer, which actually provides the abrasive resistance. Because it's like I said, I mean, I ran that Belstaff Roadmaster for about 12 years altogether. I eventually gave it to a neighbour who just started commuting to work on a bike, and I wasn't using it anymore, because as time went on I had more money. I bought leather jackets and, you know, went on to other stuff. But despite the fact I had about 3 spills wearing that jacket, yeah, there was a little bit of abrasion damage to it, but the abrasion had never got through it. It hadn't even got through the top layer, and I used to re-wax that jacket once a year. It was like a Christmas routine. While I had a few days off, I would re-wax it. So it stood up to 10 or 12 years of use, and then beyond that, I don't know how long he used it for, the guy that I gave it to, but he continued using it for a few years, and it served him well. So yeah, we survived in the 1980s, despite being cash strapped, having, you know, zero spare cash. The gear that was available to us at the price point we could afford was actually pretty decent. Probably doesn't quite stand up to standards of today, but it stood up to the standards of the time, and it was time and tested technology. You know, especially the boots, the gloves, and the jacket. You know, these have been around, built specifically for motorcycling since the 1930s. And over that sort of 50 years of manufacturing, they'd learned how to make them as safe as they possibly could. So, you know, by the 1980s, it was actually pretty decent gear, which, you know, to be fair, would probably stand the test of time far better than the stuff that's available to us today. So that's it, you know, how we survived in the 1980s riding motorcycles. We didn't all die every accident. You know, I'm a testament to that. The gear really wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as people think it was. It was fairly decent gear that I'd be quite happy to ride around in today, to be quite honest. So yeah, hopefully this has been interesting to you. You know, we still frequently see the same styles of gear now that were available back then. Nothing much has changed. All of this that I'm wearing now was very relevant. In fact, it was the mainstay of motorcycling gear in the 1980s. You know, you don't have to look back to the 1960s to see people wearing this sort of stuff as a matter of course. It's endured throughout time. It's all classic motorcycle wear that it's never gone out of fashion. It hasn't gone away and come back. It's maintained its position in motorcycling throughout the decades, for what, 18, 90 years. So right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like, hype this video, and consider becoming a subscriber if you're not already subscribed. I will of course be back on next Wednesday, so until then, ride safely, and I'll see you soon.